Good afternoon, bienvenidos y bienvenidas. My name is Angel Antonio Ruiz Lavoy. I'm the Arts and Culture Director at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. Welcome, and thank you for being here with us tonight for this Cafecito. As you may know, this year marks the beginning of a new unified research initiative at Centro called Rooted and Relational, where all of our units are focusing on a central theme to guide the research, knowledge production, and programming. For this year, the theme is Archive and the Historical Memory of Puerto Rico. When the Arts and Culture Unit was brainstorming possible artists to be featured in our Cafecito series, it became clear that we had to invite Pablo Delano to speak about the Museum of the Old Colony. Before we even had the chance to contact Pablo, Dr. Laura Katzman stepped in and submitted a proposal to bring him to this series. And then we received the very exciting news that his work was the first by Puerto Rican artist to be featured in the main exhibition at the Arsenal at the Venice Biennale. So, in a way, tonight's event was always meant to happen, and here we are, celebrating both Pablo's work and the shared focus that bring us all together this evening for this very special conversation. We're so honored to have you here, Pablo. Pablo Delano is a visual artist, photographer, an educator whose work deeply engages with themes of history, identity, and cultural memory, especially related to Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. His practice beautifully navigates the intersections of photography, visual arts, and historical research, often highlighting the complexities of colonialism, migration, and the socio-political landscape of the Puerto Rican identity. We're also pleased to have Dr. Laura Katzman with us. Dr. Katzman is a respected scholar of Puerto Rican art with a special focus on photography, and she has collaborated with Delano on the publication at the Museum of the Old Colony, an art installation by Pablo Delano. This book accompanies the latest version of Delano's installation at the James Madison University's Duke Hall Gallery of Fine Art, and features essays by leading scholars that explore his project from multiple perspectives. It's an honor to have both Pablo and Dr. Katzman here to enrich our dialogue on archives and memory in this particular context. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we hope that you enjoy the conversation. Please welcome our panelists for tonight with a big round of applause.
So I think, yes, so just to give you a sense of what's going to happen. So Pablo is going to give you a little visual journey through the Museum of the Old Colony, talking a little bit about its evolution and focusing specifically on its current iteration at the Venice Biennale in Spanish. It is going to be up through November 24th. That's right, so if you can get there, one last chance. It's been up for 6 months, and then I will after Pablo speaks, he'll show a short video clip from Venice, and then I will start the conversation. I have some questions that hopefully will generate some conversation between us, and then we'll open it up to questions. So thank you for coming on a weeknight.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to be at Centro, very important for me, I think, to be at Centro and to...
Can everyone hear? Can everyone hear in the back?
Yeah, you can hear?
Okay, good.
And to present the project here at Centro. We were speaking about some of the reasons for that, but we can get to that later in the conversation. I think I just go hold it. I think it might be easier. Yes, I'll give you a little bit of background on the project and what motivated me to begin with, although I want to focus more on the more recent developments. So it's a project I had been conceiving for a long time, but two historical events really sort of give me the push to do something, and one was the creation of the Promesa fiscal dictatorship, and the other was the little paper towel event we see here. But at the same time, for many, many years, decades, really, I was always aware of the irony that we consume this drink. I grew up drinking it, people here grew up drinking it, and without really thinking of the name of the drink or the iconography on the label, right? Well, who this was on the label, or the fact that it was filled with sugar, which was bad for us in a country full of diabetes, or the fact that we don't grow grapes, any of this. All of this sort of coalesced in this project called the Museum of the Old Colony, which is a conceptual art installation, a piece of performance art that employs a methodology of appropriation and appropriation specifically of materials that were created originally mostly to oppress us, and the idea of turning that around. I think I might have skipped it. Yeah. So the project has a long trajectory. It's been exhibited around the world in different venues, museums, galleries. But I wanted to point out that it started very small at a place called Alice Yard in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, and then grew exponentially, though at this always using these historical images always reproduced, never the originals, because for me the interest was in the content of the images, not in photographs as objects to be valued or fetishized in any way. This is an example of the kind of images, one of the first images where I really thought, oh, this is just unbelievable. It's just so jarring. We actually know who the photographer is, Margarita Alina Ham, who was a colonial bureaucrat that was sent by the US government. But the gaze of this photograph, I find so riveting, and then combined with these very hurtful racist captions, it affected me profoundly, and I knew I wanted to work with images like this somehow. So from a very simple just display of images, I began to think about the relationship between images and objects and the whole history of art and how those images might be echoed in the history of art, Western art in particular, the whole idea of the canon, the venerated canon of Western art. And I started looking for parallels and started introducing images into the, objects into the installation. There have been several key figures that have affected me profoundly in my thinking about this project. And I don't want to mention them all because there are too many, but one person specifically that I want to mention because he had a connection to Hunter, Dr. Maurice Berger, who saw the project at an early state and really took it on wholeheartedly. Tried to promote it, invited me to produce a version of the project at the Center for Art, Design, and Visual Culture at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which we did. And he wrote this essay for this catalog, which you can all take for free. It's, I think, on the table outside, so please be sure to take one with you. It's a beautiful essay, but he understood profoundly the implications and the many levels on which the project works. So I'm so grateful to him, and I'm so sad, probably many of you know, that he passed away in the first weeks of the pandemic of COVID. The project sort of took on its own kind of speed. I was invited to do a version, an outdoor version for the Photoville festival here in New York City and Brooklyn, and it was a banner that was displayed here under the Brooklyn Bridge. And then Professor Katzman invited me to do the exhibit at James Madison University, the Duke Hall Gallery of Fine Arts, and this was a vast space which I relished having the space because I've been filling it up with more objects and more images.
We built an extra wall.
Built an extra wall. So we're gonna look, and of course that led to the other book, which is not free, but available outside. Right, here it is. And we're gonna look at a few of the details from that installation. The piece on the left is called Cocos y Platos, which you only see the cocos, right? But it's the cocos with the images on the wall and the coconuts on the table. The image on the lower right has to do with this whole fabrication of the fantasy of the Jíbaro. The picture on the upper right is deals with something that I didn't know existed, but apparently it very much existed. The government of Puerto Rico created in 1948 a school for domestic service, where women would be trained to be maids, and then they would be shipped off to work in households in Westchester County and whatnot. I later I've actually discovered an incredible amount of visual documentation of that whole process, and the next version, not the version that's in Venice now, but the next version of the Museum of the Old Colony will have many images featuring these women. Not only the one image that I had when I did this, but the women getting off the airplanes, the women being met here in New York by their quote-unquote handlers, and other details of what their schooling involved in. They're really just se taparon los pelos. I don't know how else to say it. It's some really horrible images, right? But at the same time, after Maria, I was invited to present the work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Juan, and then it was reinstalled. It was the first exhibit after Maria in the museum, but then it was reinstalled more recently, curated by Marian Ramirez. And well, actually, in the first version is when you saw it, right? The first time, right after Hurricane Maria,
2018, right.
Laura was there and and that's when you got the idea to immediately begin thinking about how to bring it to JMU, right? But the second time that the installation was installed at the Museo de Arte Contemporáneo in San Juan, somebody else saw it, right? And his name was Adriano Pedrosa, and he happened to be the curator of the Biennale de Venecia. And I found out that he had seen it because he posted it on his Instagram page. And I was blown away because people started sending me the links. And he posted 10 pictures of it on his Instagram page. And then it turned out he tagged me and he reached out to me, and that began a series of conversations. Right, so I sort of knew who he was, but then I researched and I was blown away at the kinds of exhibits that he had curated. Exhibits that had traveled all over the world, dealing with often with historical issues like Afro-Atlantic histories, which was in the National Gallery and traveled around here. So he's an amazing person, and we entered into a number of conversations. I sent him material to his home. He's the director of the Sao Paulo Museum of Art in Brazil. He's Brazilian. He is the first curator of the Biennale to be openly queer, and the first curator of the Biennale to be from Latin America, from the Global South. Right? So amazing person, and I was so honored just that he reached out to me. Right? And we held a few discussions, and then I noticed that in the press, this was announced, that he had announced the theme for the Biennale, which was, because these are themed exhibits, and the theme was foreigners everywhere. The Biennale is divided into two main sort of components. One is the international pavilions, which each country has their own little building and they choose an artist to represent them. But at the center of it, there's an enormous building called the Centro Pavilion in the Giardini, and then there's another building in another venue called the Arsenal. And these two buildings host the biggest show, which is called the International Art Exposition. This is the 60th International Art Exposition, which is what Pedrosa was curating. So when he announced this theme, he had not yet invited me, but we had had these very constructive conversations. And I wrote to him an email and I said, Adriano, I don't know if you're thinking of still inviting me or not. We've talked about it, but whatever you, but I've just seen your announcement for your theme, Foreigners Everywhere. And whether you invite me or not, I hope you invite an artist from Puerto Rico, because we are the professional foreigners everywhere. Right, we're foreigners in our own country, we're foreigners wherever we travel on a passport that's foreign to us, right? That got a response from him right away. Can we talk in the morning? And that's when the invitation came to bring this project to La Bienal. So this is a kind of a map showing on the top the location of how much real estate La Bienal takes up in Venice. The red areas are the two main precincts. The one on the top is the Arsenale, the one on the bottom is the Giardini. And then in the bottom map, you see the central pavilion in black. You can see how much bigger it is than any of the surrounding smaller international pavilions. So it's a massive building. La Bienal has a very interesting history. Right, it started in 1895, and it's been controversial almost throughout its whole history. There have been often protests involved. In 68, students were protesting because some of the guidelines were still reflective of Mussolini's time, and they actually managed to change that. A lot of the artists who were participating were in favor and withdrew their work. They were in favor of the reforms. And so I found myself in Venice about 6 weeks before the opening of the exhibition.
The sacrifices artists make.
Yeah, the sacrifices. How one suffers for one's art. I woke up the next morning and I walked to the Giardini where I show my credentials and they waved me in, and I'm faced with the enormous central pavilion, which is covered with a huge scaffolding because one of the focuses of Foreigners Everywhere was indigenous artists. And so this is one of the things that Pedrosa identified as the things that were important to him in Foreigners Everywhere: queer artists who have never had the opportunity to be seen before, indigenous artists who were often denigrated and thought of as quote-unquote primitive, artists from colonized countries, and in general artists who have not been part of the mainstream of art, but who in his view deserve to be seen on a world stage. Right, so then I walked in and the guards were there, and everyone is acknowledging my badge and it's very heady, right, to walk into this incredible space. And I find that all my work has been very carefully packaged in these crates, which cannot be opened without me being present. So then we started opening the crates. I had with me the design that I had sent in advance, and I walked into the room, which had been painted to my specifications and walls built to my specifications, and this is one of the designs for the main walls that you'll see. And so, poco a poco, we began to bring the things in. The desk is an important component in the installation, which you'll see coming up shortly. So they bring in the desk, and they're photographing every square inch of it because they want to make sure that if it gets scratched, the insurance covers it. And the ironic thing is that it cost an arm and a leg to bring this desk from my studio in Hartford, Connecticut to Venice, but the desk actually is
a found object.
a found object. It has almost no value. The crate, though, is beautiful. The crate that it came in, right? So we begin installing with an incredible team of technicians, very much perfectionists like me. So we got along great. I found that my Spanish was very similar. We got a lot. I didn't need the English-speaking people. We were able to communicate very well with the Italian crew. They seemed to appreciate the work. So the installation began, and then we ended up with this massively huge room filled with hundreds of objects and hundreds of photographs. And so we'll take a little bit of time to go through the installation. How are we doing? Good. Okay, we're doing good, right? Okay, so this is the desk as it was finished. You saw it before. Now this is the kind of the desk with all of the objects on top of it and all the images behind it. I'm sure that some of you will recognize the person in the middle of the wall in the back, Lolita Lebron, right? And the other picture with her. And so we can talk a little bit more during the conversation about the role of the desk, and Professor Guzman here has written extensively about it. Maybe you would chip into the contribute to the conversation a bit as well too, but it's a kind of the desk of the colonizer in my mind, this crazy character that sort of exists in my head. So the desk is covered with objects, including Teddy Roosevelt kind of sneering and laughing at the whole thing. It's very funny,
That's
right?
That's
Ricky's
an Avon
laughing, right?
aftershave. That's an Avon aftershave lotion, right, from 1970s?
Yeah, something
Yes.
like that. At a certain point, I felt, I can't make this too difficult to interpret. So there are these hints that suggest that, okay, that people should take this with a bit of a humor, but also irony, right? So the little white lies jar is actually a jar. This is actually a real jar. I didn't make it. I found it. Somebody actually made it and sold it, right? But there's the little white lies jar. Right? There's also the trophy, which we'll get to, the photography trophy and other objects. And National Geographic, you may know, within the history of representation, has a long, complex, and difficult, and sometimes painful and hurtful history as well, right? So it's really kind of hard to capture in photographs what it's like. Some of you have been there, Larry, Asami, with people, and the pictures just don't get really what it's like to be surrounded by all of this imagery, and a lot of it very uncomfortable, very, very hurtful, and not so much the picture. The pictures operate on one level, but the captions, the original captions that were included with the pictures, are sometimes just searingly insulting, and that's the history, right? This is a section about language and the imposition of the English language on Puerto Rico up until 1947, when they realized it wasn't going to work, right? But there are objects around this too. The books on the desk are one. Let me see if there's one book called El Buen Castellano. The other one is like an English primer. A few other objects, including my libreta superior. Some of you might remember those notebooks. This is actually my libreta. Right. There are a lot of focuses on stereographs, which are these double pictures that were taken at the early 20th century, and they work on a viewer that gives you a 3D version, 3D view of the picture. These are particularly offensive, very, very difficult. I mean, but I just felt they needed to be seen. I needed to put it out there. This is a close-up of one of them, which deals with many of the issues that come up over and over and over and over again in the installation, which is race and class and gender. Obviously here, colonialism, right? Waiting for Uncle Sam to come and the backside of this particular stereo card has a very disturbing long text, which maybe we can get to, I don't know, but it refers to the children living a Topsy-like existence. Topsy being the character from Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is the little slave girl who was incorrigible until she was given the unconditional love of the white lady that was her master. It was just anyway, right? So yes, the Patriot Economy Eraser is an actual eraser, right? And in the context of our culture and our existence being questioned and erased, I couldn't not include this. This, by the way, was an object that was also donated by a good friend to the archive of the Museum of the Old Colony. So that's at the center of the wall about language. There is an introductory text that walks you through and contextualizes. I'm very mindful of the international audience. and it's in Italian and English, so it sort of breaks it down to very simple terms. There is a QR code at the bottom left of this, which if you hit it with your phone, it takes you to all the sources, every single thing, every single image in the entire installation. It tells you what book it came from, what archive it came from, etc. Right? Food and colonialism, right? The so-called export sodas, which are just in every household, but think about where they came from, and corned beef. This is okay, so at the sort of, if the desk is not the central focus, then the old colony timeline is, which is, these is the bottles that and cans that are the envase, how you say that, container that the drink old colony came in, right? And so, I know you want to talk about this, Laura, but the reference to museums and the language of museums, the way that museums formulate their displays in ways that to be pedagogical or whatever, and so I adopted that and as a critique of museums. But that's it. Anyway, to go back, I surrounded the old colony bottles, which were from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, with all of these images that reflect the very pressing issues of race and class and gender that I thought were, sort of needed to be put out there. Back another image of the desk, a little more detailed. This is a section that deals with the diaspora. We can come back to it if you want, but some of these pictures are pictures that actually show the maids getting off the airplane. And the one in the lower left, they're being met by an agent who places them in the homes. This is actually a toy that you can get now today on Amazon, and you can find it in our schools. Soft and safe. Are we all feeling soft and safe? There are two video pieces that are run as loops, and they're mashups, just like the rest of the installation. It's just hundreds of video clips that are edited together, and obviously I think you would recognize what's going on in the video on the right here, even though it was only a brief. The other images, the other pictures in the tableau has to do with the debt. As we go moving closer. So that's what it looked like, and then it was opening day, right? And it was packed, it was packed. And to give you a sense of perspective, the blue area is the area that Pedrosa assigned to my installation, to the Museum of the Old Colony. So you can see that it's centrally located, and in order to get to some of the galleries, you have to go through my space. And so it's very, very central. It's very hard to miss it. It's the largest room that was assigned to an individual artist in the entire pavilion. So I'm very honored, and very grateful to Pedrosa for having that vision, because I think that this was not just like, oh, he needs a big space, let's give him the space. He's thinking strategically about putting in foreigners everywhere, putting the place that's still colonized at the center, because a lot of the other work that surrounds it is beautiful and glorious, but done because people have managed to liberate themselves from the colonial grip, right? Just a few snapshots of the first few days. It was incredibly packed and amazing to just experience how people experienced the exhibit. Including many strangers going through. People were mesmerized, people were blown away, crying, people were doing selfies, and I don't know if any of you recognize the picture on the lower left who that is, but weeks before she died, Barbara Yestapia was there, and she was a wonderful artist and a great person. So it's very hard for me to even show this, but she's extraordinary artist who we lost for probably no reason, probably because of medical incompetence. Yeah. Anyway, people reenacting the pictures, these two women on the right, they wanted to be photographed reenacting the handshake that you see in the picture on the wall above. Some selfies, me and Laviano, and the picture on the top right, you recognize some of the artists because there was a collateral event with the biennial. It was not part of it was on the side, it was in another space, but some of our wonderful artists were there. Daniel Lindranos, Willa Sterling, Chemi Rosado Sejo, and participated in a small exhibit that was an official collateral event of the Biennale. And with that, we'll just see some video so you can get a bit of sense of the space and of what some of me, but also your Centro fellow here, Professor Guzman, had to say.
So we are here at the Venice Biennale 2024 to celebrate the work of Pablo Delano and his installation, Museum of the Old Colony. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling exhilarated and uplifted. The model that you saw in Hartford has been transformed from a small-scale model on a desktop to a full-fledged installation that takes up almost 2,800 square feet. Venice is a huge challenge. For any artist, it's a challenge to think about how your work is going to be perceived in an international space like this, with visitors coming from all over the world, and specifically in my project, which deals with my homeland. At the same time, I think I want to make it relatable. There are issues, believe it or not, that Puerto Rico and Venice have in common. I wanted to tap into those. One of those issues is the question of tourism. Both locations are very tourist dependent for their economy. So there's a section in this iteration of the installation that deals specifically with tourism, and I think it can be read in both levels, as the local level where it deals specifically with Puerto Rico, but then on a broader level that those problems exist here in Venice as well.
Can you talk a little bit about your reactions to or perspectives of the audiences at Venice?
The most dramatic thing is just the sheer volume. On any given day, the gallery can have 200 or 300 people in it at a time, and that's a little bit overwhelming. The international audience is quite different. I find very little resistance to accepting the notion that Puerto Rico is a colonial possession of the U.S., and it's very rewarding to see the impact the work is having on the viewers.
So what has Trinity's role been in this installation?
The first version of this project was exhibited in Trinidad as part of a conference that was supported by Trinity College. With this achievement of being invited to the Biennale, Trinity really stepped up and made it possible for me to participate in this in many ways. In addition to directly supporting the project, being in an environment with colleagues who are willing to share their knowledge and their expertise with me and engage in a discussion is really incredibly valuable. Do you see your input in what I did here?
When I first experienced it, it was at NYU, and at that point it was entirely photographic. So to see the ways in which the installation has expanded, to see the ways in which your art practice has grown to now have 3D objects and have objects be in conversation with photography is tremendous. I think you're telling such more dynamic stories. Thinking about, for example, the museum desk and the ways in which just how it's evolved in this iteration. And now there's a second desk, there's a student desk.
The desk itself ended up being part of this installation by a purely random act. In an earlier version of the installation, I visited the gallery where the exhibit was going to take place. There was a desk in the middle of the space, and the gallery director immediately assured me that that would be removed. But when I saw it there, it sparked an idea. Well, if I'm following up on this whole notion of what is a museum and what are some of the characteristics of museums, you always have a desk when you enter, and there's always an attendant sitting at that desk. So I said, no, wait a minute, leave the desk and let me use it. So that was the beginning of this whole concept of the desk. It became more of a tableau and more of a sculptural piece. And every time that I've included the desk, I've added more and more and more and more and more objects to it. It becomes sort of the center of power of the imaginary person who runs the museum.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between the museum desk and the student desk?
One of the stories I thought would be compelling to tell here in Venice is the suppression of the Spanish language to Americanize people. One of those components were photographs of children being taught English. As with many parts of the exhibit where there are echoes and references, it might be interesting to have the adult desk and then its little sibling, the student desk, and the objects that are placed upon it, which are a textbook that teaches English and, ironically, also a textbook that teaches Spanish, but is marked on the back property of the government of Puerto Rico, written in English.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of visual imagery in the show?
I began about 20 years ago to collect imagery produced by outsiders, the colonizer. It's a kind of a morbid fascination with this kind of imagery that led me down the road to figuring out how I might integrate that into an actual work of art. Photographers were sent all over the world to make these photographs, so I thought that those were an important way to introduce the U.S. invasion of Puerto Rico and the beginning of the U.S. colonization.
What are your aspirations moving forward for both the installation and your art practice?
Well, based on the feedback that I've had here from the people I've met and the contacts I've made, I'm hoping that the installation will continue to live on. Having the opportunity to be on this stage in this specific spot in the center of the central pavilion of the Biennale de Venezia is an incredible honor, and it's also an incredible responsibility in the sense that I'm representing what I would describe as a colonial trauma.
Okay.
Actually, before I begin, I wanted to say something. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I do think it's important for those who haven't seen the exhibition or who don't know much about the installation, to understand Pablo's practice. I think the content of these photographs and these objects are so powerful that the temptation is that you just read them literally when you go through the exhibition, and you might miss the meta-commentary aspect of it if you don't really think about the construction of this installation, right? This installation is constructed as a construct. It's a fictive museum, a fictive archive, and the meticulous planning and selecting and choosing and putting works in conversation with each other is so well thought out and kind of seamless in a way. You might not notice that when you walk through it. So I think it's important to deconstruct it and to take a step back and to understand the meticulous planning, the construction of this, and also the attention to the actual objects, that the only change is the rephotographing, right? You rephotograph these photographs and then you blow them up to a much larger scale, but the captions are never changed, never altered. The photographs are never cropped from the way they were used in their original context. The objects, as Pablo said, are largely never altered, right, with a few minor exceptions. So I think the idea of representing this work and sort of stepping back in a way and letting the work speak for itself, at the same time the constructed nature of it, the fact that you are the curator, you're the archivist, you're the collector, you're the artist, you're the constructor of this narrative. So anyway, I think that sometimes that can be lost if you walk into this installation and just start reading the content in a kind of literal way. So I just wanted to make that point. Now I'll begin. So it's really wonderful to be back at Centro. I've been associated with Centro since 2008. Actually, I've been researching here for many years, a long-term book project on 1940s photographs, documentary photographs of Puerto Rico, at the moment when, the late 40s, early 50s, when Puerto Rico was establishing a new status vis-a-vis the United States, although many would argue it was just a same status, just given a different name, Estado Libre Asociado, and the resistance to that status. The context of these photographs have a lot to do with the industrialization, the modernization of Puerto Rico, and its improvements as well as its discontents. and the legacy of that today in all its complexity, and also the moment of intense cultural nationalism that was being developed at the time. So that's sort of the context of the photographs that I work on, and CENTRO has been a big part of that research. So it's wonderful to be here. I worked a lot under the archivist, or worked with the archivist Pedro Juan Hernandez, who retired just a couple of years ago, and CUNY's president, Felix Matos, was the former director of CENTRO in the years that I had started working here. Excuse me. So I thought I would start with telling you a little bit about my interest in Pablo's work, how that developed very briefly, and then I want to ask some questions so we can have a dialogue here. So given the research that I just mentioned to you, Pablo is, of course, an obvious resource for me, oral history, giving me access to archival materials, sharing memories, and other kinds of materials. So I'm just grateful for that. And we got to know each other over the last 20 plus years. But I was always interested in his work as a documentary photographer, working in the social documentary genre for over 40 years. But I was particularly interested in the Museum of the Old Colony in the way I see it as a kind of shift from his documentary practice, excuse me, to maybe a more conceptual photographic practice, and really thinking about photography in a different way. That is the kind of use of photography for the purpose of meta-commentary. I know there's a lot of discussion these days about the term, the concept post-photography, which I think was defined back in 2015, sort of officially, although it's been around for a long time, the idea of appropriating photography and using it for other purposes than simply documentation, right? So I was interested in this shift from the sort of the documentary to the conceptual, and the way in which the photographs are appropriated, represented, set into dialogue with other objects, other images, to provoke us, really, to provoke us in sometimes very uncomfortable ways, to think about some very hard truths and difficult realities that many people don't like to face. The other thing that interested me in Pablo's work, or that dovetailed with my own interests, was his interest in museums and archives. And I was very interested in the way his work engages and critiques both museums and archives, and the power that both these institutions have in creating and promoting certain narratives about people, places, and histories. I've been thinking about this for a very long time, the role of museums and archives in US culture, and through inclusion, exclusion, categorization, how such institutions can shape the way we look at our own history, the way we look at the histories of others that are, quote, collected in our own archives. So those were some of the reasons why I got very interested in this work. And this led me to invite him, as he said, to the Duke Gallery of Fine Art at James Madison University. And I'm very proud that I think still it is the largest and most extensive iteration of the work in the States. We may be surpassed by that soon, but it's not a competition.
Spring 2026.
In 2026, it may be surpassed. But we were very proud of that, and also my interest in bringing it to Virginia was quite deliberate. The idea of bringing his work to the former capital of the Confederacy at the moment when the Confederate monument controversy was really exploding, and Virginia was really the epicenter of that. If you think about it, more Civil War battles were fought in Virginia than anywhere else in the US, and therefore more Civil War monuments. So that controversy was raging really as we were planning Pablo's work. You know, what does it mean to bring a work about the imposition of imperial ideas onto another nation? What does it mean to bring a work that engages with race and marginalization and othering in a place where which has its own very, very difficult history of oppression and racial discrimination and othering, right? So we were sort of fascinated, I think, by that context. And we can talk a little bit more about that later when we talk about some site specificity issues with regard to the Museum of the Old Colony. And And also, I was interested in getting together a group of scholars to put together a book because the Museum of the Old Colony had been on exhibit for several years at that point, and there was no sort of proper book attached to it. And so we brought together scholars from various disciplines because the work is so interdisciplinary. I thought we needed to honor it with interdisciplinarity in the book. So we got UVA Press on board and my university on board. We invited various scholars, Cesar Salgado, scholar of literary studies in both Cuba and Puerto Rico at University of Texas, Austin. We invited Laura Roulet, an independent curator of Latino and Caribbean art in Washington, D.C. We invited Beth Hinderleiter, the director of the Duke Gallery, who is a specialist in feminist and black issues of blackness and race in art. We invited Amanda Guzman, who's a fellow here now at CENTRO, who wrote a wonderful essay from a kind of anthropological perspective on the museum desk that Pablo was talking about, and she's a professor at Trinity College where Pablo teaches. And I also authored an essay in the book as well. So we brought this book together, brought these essays together in this book, and I'm also very honored that the book is on display at the Venice Biennale in the Book Pavilion, and I hope, or I'd like to think that we played some small role in calling.
It becomes part of their permanent
And it becomes
library.
part of their permanent library. And I know that when Adriana Pedrosa received the book, I do think it played some role in contributing to selecting Pablo for the Venice Biennale. So so I'm very, very proud of that. And excuse me, and hopefully maybe Amanda and others who are related to the book can give us some insights into discussing the work at greater length. I should say that I'm very grateful for many of Amanda's views and discussions, and she's been part of our journey really in exploring the Museum of the Old Colony, and thank you for your profound insights, which have helped us today think about what we're talking about as well today. So on that note, then I'll turn to some questions that I'd like to ask Pablo. And to back up really to some origins and inspirations. I know that you spent a lot of time in Trinidad over a period of about 10 years, photographing in Trinidad, Carnival and other events and other communities, excuse me, other festivities, festivals, and daily life. And I know how important Trinidad has been for your thinking about Puerto Rico. So I was hoping you can share with the audience a little bit about that experience.
Well, you're right, it was very formative, and it's during those years when I was photographing extensively in Trinidad that I began to think about what kind of work I could do to address our colonial situation, specifically because I was experiencing a post-colonial country that was struggling to define itself and define its own national identity, and it made some very interesting choices, such as to publicly and officially embrace its diversity and its arts as a means of creating a national identity. So yes, it was important, and maybe the thing that was the most specific thing that was the most powerful was experiencing Carnival, but specifically Sailor Mass. Sailor Mass's masquerade, and Sailor Mass was something that existed for a long time, but with the U.S. occupation of Trinidad, they occupied Trinidad too. They had very huge military bases, even though it was a British colony. They had a deal going with the British, and the U.S. had a huge Navy base called Chaguaramas, a huge airfield called Waller Field, which still, and these places still exist. It was at the time the largest airstrip in the world. But in any case, out of that U.S. military occupation, Sailor Mass or Sailor Masquerade just blossomed. And we all know that sailors behave badly. I mean, I have memories of walking through Viejo San Juan as a child and seeing these sailors in their white suits behaving badly, getting drunk, urinating publicly, throwing up, going and seeking of prostitutes and all of that. And in Trinidad Carnival, in Trinidad that happened as well, but Carnival gave a coping mechanism and a way to kind of almost appropriate those behaviors, but then convert them and make them into a parody and a way of acting out the absurdity and the cruelty of this kind of behavior. And that, and so even though it's very different and it's performative, it really started this sort of thinking process about maybe I could kind of do something with photographs in the way that they were doing with this character, the sailor. So yes, it was very important, and Trinidad has a very powerful place in my heart, and I think the photographs which are in this book, will speak to that. So.
Well, there is a performative aspect too, right? We've talked about this before. The fictive aspect of the museum, the archive. You're the curator, you're the archivist, you're the constructor of these narratives, and the desk, the museum desk, has sort of an official, right? It implies that there's an official who has left the room, will be back soon, right? So there is a kind of performative aspect, I think, implied in the installation.
But there's also the element of chance. I mean, the video explained the desk came about because it was there, and they were going to take it out, and I ended up in Trinidad by chance, because I met a professor who saw my photographs and said, "Oh, you need to go to Trinidad," and she handed me the ticket to go to Carnival in 1997. So
the chance and the performative aspect. The other thing I wanted to the next thing I wanted to talk about was the way in which your work engages museums. Nelson Rivera, in a very powerful review of the Museum of the Old Colony and the Venice Biennale, he talks about museographic strategies, and I love that term. So with the increasing use of objects in your installation and the increasingly complex tableaus that you create and these carefully curated ensembles, the objects placed in dialogue with photographs, I'm really interested in how you engage museum strategies. You talked a little bit about it with the Old Colony display case. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that and other strategies that you use to both invoke the museum but also kind of subvert it.
Well, I've had the opportunity to visit museums that have since changed, but when I visited them in my 20s, it made a very powerful impression. Anthropological museums, or even the Museum of Natural History in New York City, where the white people would be on the one side of the glass, and behind the glass would be these dummies made out of wax of the other people. But even beyond that, there's a kind of syntax of museums. Like, first of all, when you walk in, it's a Greek temple, so then there's the connection to the Greeks and the Romans and the whole pantheon of and so-called canon of Western art. But then when you walk in there through those Greek columns, you're walking into truth and beauty, because that's what it's supposed to be, right? So you don't question it, and then you walk in and you see this whole way of presenting things that's been constructed. Like when you go to the art museum, if it's in a gold frame, you know it's good, right? And so there's all this sort of physical characteristics that we just don't question. We just it's in the museum. It's good art. It's in a gold frame. It's got to be good. And so I started thinking about how to subvert all of that. And so specifically here, I didn't want any of the so-called art framed. We had a funny experience, right? You invited me to Laura was a visiting fellow in Germany, and at a very prestigious institution where she thought they might like to see a version of this exhibit, and the invitation was extended, but they insisted that the art had to be framed.
Right. right.
So
They
guess
couldn't-
what? It didn't happen because I wanted to use not frames, but the anti-frame, which is push pins,
Push
right?
pins.
You're not supposed to use push pins in
Yeah.
a museum, but push pins are a very important part. I mean, I don't know if you can see, but
And they
all
wanted
the
to know what push pins, so Pablo actually FedExed a box of push pins, so I could actually present to this institution to show them the kinds of push pins and it was not accepted.
they
It
had
was
these
not
beautiful
accepted.
wood frames.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point is they're push pins, but they're also gold push pins to reference not only the gold frames in the museum, but the gold that the colonizer extracted from, Puerto Rico till it was all gone, which is pretty fast. But then they went on to extract gold from everywhere else they went, right? So yes, the things are put up with push pins, and there are a lot of other things like the vitrines, the glass cases that are,
Can you go back to the museum, the Old Colony display case?
The
'Cause I like
bottles?
The
You want the
bottles, yeah,
bottles,
because I find that one really, really fascinating. Yeah, this one here, yeah.
Right, so the timeline is another premise of the museum. That there's always a timeline, and this happened first, and then this, and sometimes they actually do it as a line.
You see the evolution, right? The evolution, which is something you see in natural history museums, right? So he's kind of mimicking that. But I have a sort of wonderful anecdote about this too. There was a very distinguished Puerto Rican poet came to the installation. I had the privilege of walking her through, and she was just stopped in her tracks by this installation. She said, "I have been drinking this Old Colony soda my whole life, and I never ever thought about it. I never thought about the image. I never thought about the title. I never thought about how it had changed over time. But somehow seeing it isolated, separated in a beautifully constructed display case confers importance, right? It forces you to think about it in a new way that you wouldn't think about it when you're taking it off the shelf, right? So so again, using those museum strategies to force people to think about things that they might not have thought about, thinking about it from a new way, but also, for me, it's giving significance to something that seems so throwaway, that seems so insignificant, a can of soda, and yet the meaning that is actually embedded in that, in terms of its origins and how it came about, right,
Yeah,
is
another
loaded.
Another one of the strategies is that if you've been to now that you were doing research in the archive, right? So the archives, there's always a stamp, right? There's like the British Museum has its stamp. It's usually a little red stamp, and so all of these are stamped. Every piece of the go back to it has the official Old Colony rubber stamp stamped on it, because that's what you would find in an archive of a museum or a library.
Can you go back to the 4 pictures of the children, the stereographs?
Yeah.
Another interesting museum strategy, again, I appropriate this from Nelson Rivera's wonderful review, powerful review. He talks more about these museographic strategies. He says that everything is so meticulously placed and framed, not in literal frames, but framing of an image, right? Just flanking images with objects. Everything's very precise, and it kind of mimics the way in which things appear in museums often, right? In this very precise, austere way that again not only confers significance, but it all seems so ordered and so authoritative and so true, right? And then you kind of go up to it and this shock of recognition of some of the horror that you're actually looking at in this otherwise very pristine installation, right? So there's that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in this case also, this grouping deals specifically with one of the colonizers' strategies, which was to infantilize. And you see that not only in Puerto Rico, but in other places where, there's a white colonial power that seeks to depict their colonial subjects as at best innocent little children who need strict discipline and
waiting
to
for
be
Uncle
taught
Sam.
proper hygiene and all this.
And one of the captions, I think, for the upper right is "Waiting for Uncle Sam." Right?
Yeah, and the one on the lower left is "Nobody loves me."
So the interesting thing about museums and the kinds of ways in which Pablo's engaging with them, I think becomes a meta-commentary, right? The installation becomes a meta-commentary on many things. In fact, a meta-commentary on the ways in which museums can confer significance and truth, presenting truthful narratives, and that's really powerful if you think about it, because in so many museum studies, or so many studies about museums, museums always rank, or I should say in studies about people's faith in trusted institutions, or people's trust in institutions, let's say in the United States, museums always rank very high in terms of people's trust in an institution. Museums always rank very high to this day. They're one of the most trusted institutions. People go to museums and believe that what they're seeing is accurate, is fact-checked, is truthful. So I think we can't forget that when we're thinking about how your work is a kind of meta-commentary on the trusted institution of the museum, how you play and subvert that. And play is gonna get me to my next point, which is we also can't forget the role of humor and play in Pablo's work, because it's very laced throughout. It's very profoundly integral to your work. So can you talk a little bit about the role of play or humor? Any specific works, maybe the Soft and Safe Hispanic Family?
It's all laced throughout, but I mean, I think the easiest, I mean, humor is a strategy of survival in colonized places. It's a way of coming to terms with your situation, and a way of, I don't know, it's just part of the day-to-day existence, way to move forward.
Can you turn to the coconuts?
Which one?
The one with the politicians.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's humor on so many different levels, right? There's the kind of absurdity of these, what are these coconuts doing on this, table, and then you look at the photographs and there are a lot of politicians drinking from the coconut, right? As a way to speak to their connection to the people, or to the land.
Yeah, this wall has the most recognizable politicians as
Yeah.
Roberto Sanchez Vilella and Luis Ferré and Fortuño, and I think Pierluisi in the top, and in the bottom is
Jesus
Piñero,
Piñero.
all showing that they could be of the people by drinking un coco frío.
So there's this humor on many levels.
The other one is,
Yeah.
those are Kool-Aid bottles. They look exactly like bombs. So don't drink the Kool-Aid. Anyway, so that's the kind of,
Yeah.
references to like Jonestown and.
And then there's a military. Did you have a military table in Venice?
No.
No. Okay. The JMU installation, there was a table of books about Puerto Rico, laced with little toy military soldiers throughout.
Yeah, but those are the soldiers that we all played with when we were, those little plastic.
It was called a splendid little war, right? Yeah, and if you go back to the Soft and Safe Hispanic Family, you can't make this stuff up.
I don't know where. Yeah, I'm trying to.
I mean, it's humorous, it's demeaning, and it also takes on a new meaning in the context of this display case and the context of the show.
You could get everybody too. You could get the Soft and Safe Asian family.
Yeah. In different shades, different color. But the safety of it in the context of buying this toy for your children, right, is the physical safety of it, right? But then the safety issue takes on such a different meaning when it's isolated in this way. It becomes so much more insidious and
but it's also
offensive.
interesting, in Italy, a lot of people responded to this particular object, and when I told them, I just bought it on Amazon, they were incredulous.
It's also very gender stereotyped, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And
I
this
bought every
is
set, by the way. There's a lot of different companies that make them.
my students thought this object was from 1950s, but this is actually from
You
today.
can buy it now.
This is today.
You can go,
This is
you
today.
take out your phone and
Yeah,
buy it right now.
Yeah. You can buy. But
Actually, kind of a mordant wit.
yes,
The juxtaposition here between the women being sent to the mainland and separated from their families of origins, and some of them are surely mothers already, and then this little boxed family.
thank
So
you,
thank you
Sally.
for that juxtaposition.
And those are the kinds of juxtapositions that emerge, right, in these conversations when you
And
place
in
these
the earlier
objects together.
version of, and
Yeah.
the version that was at JMU, the Softly Safe family was juxtaposed with very different pictures, but to the same kind of effect. It was juxtaposed against some stereographs of,
Families in front of their bohíos.
in front of their, like,
and said
lined
there's-
up as, you know,
Yeah,
to
just-
hear the typical natives lined up in front of their home,
There's no place like home, things like that, yeah.
but very much in these same gender roles.
Yes, right. So that's another thing, actually, the continuity too that you were tracing in this installation is these photographs mostly from the late 19th, early 20th century up through the 1970s or 80s, but even some objects that are from today. So you can trace a kind of genealogy of othering right, in that sense. But continuing on this idea of meta commentary, we talked about it with regard to museums. One could also think about this installation as a meta commentary on the practice of photography itself and the critique of the practice of documentary photography itself, which is something
Should I
that's
go to the
yes,
picture?
which is something that has always interested me. Some of the aspects of the installation will show you. Oh, yeah, this one here. So I think this may be your only altered object. Is that right? Did I just reveal a secret? The camera cannot lie.
It's semi-altered. I think.
Semi-altered. It's an altered ready-made. And then the two photographs at the right from the James Madison installation, which show the same display case just from different perspectives. And it was called The Tools of the Trade. And what was so fascinating about this in the context of the show at JMU is you're showing the cameras, the actual cameras that were used to photograph Puerto
Not
Ricans.
the actual cameras.
I mean, not the actual cameras,
Similar.
the types of cameras, not the actual,
Yeah.
the same types of cameras, but they were authentic in that they were from that time period. Some of my students wanted to know what cameras Pablo used to photograph, to take these photographs. So which, again, tells you that people can come in quite innocently, right, and not recognize that this is a meta commentary. And they were not taken by Pablo. But the cameras are in there, and also there's a typewriter, to remind you that someone took these photographs, a person took these photographs, someone was commissioned to take these photographs, someone was paid to take these photographs. These are the tools of, I think you've said, the tools of the colonizer, the tools of of those documenting the new possession, the new possessions, and the typewriter. Someone had to type up the captions, right? So these are the actual physical objects that were used to construct these pictures, to construct these narratives. So that was quite powerful, I think, in the exhibition. And there's also even a color chart. Can you see that sort of color chart there at the lower right, which sort of harkens back to the 18th and 19th century.
It is a skin color chart,
Skin color
and there's
charts.
also calipers that were used for measuring skulls, and
Right.
this evolved into objects that are on the desk in Venice. Two pictures on the right are from JMU, from before Venice, but those objects ended up on the desk along with some cards that show skulls from a book, which I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's the first book of scientific racism, which was this whole very, very heavily illustrated book of engravings of skulls. It's at the University of Pennsylvania. Amanda, do you remember the name of the? I thought you might, but anyway, it's really.
And it's documented. I mean, you have it.
Yeah,
You have it documented.
it
Everything is documented.
turns out that
Yes.
Trinity College, where I teach, actually has not only has a copy of the book, which is very rare, but a copy of the book inscribed to Trinity College by the original, which I found out purely by chance. But right, Chummer, you think not surprised, right?
So So in terms of the tools of the colonizer, the fact that people constructed these photographs, they don't just appear, right? So that also speaks to a system, right? It speaks to a system. But I think to go back to this idea of the meta-commentary on the practice of documentary photography, I think on the most obvious meaning I think that emerges from that is the idea of that we must be critical, obviously, of the trust that we place in documentary photographs. I think that's obviously something that many of us would take away. But I think it's actually more complicated than that, too. In other words, I think there are more layers of meaning that I think that the installation compels us to think critically about photography on many levels. For example, getting us to think about how do photographs signify, right? What gives them meaning? What gives them power? How does context affect that meaning? How do captions and scale and size and putting photographs next to each other, have a conversation, affect their meaning? So I think the installation comments on photography in many ways and on many levels, and even getting us to think about what does a more ethical social documentary photography look like? I'm also particularly struck by the self-criticality. I didn't know if that was a word, but I looked it up and it is a word. The self-criticality that you bring as an artist, someone who has practiced documentary photography for 40 years, someone who comes from a family that respected documentary photography, learning from your father, a distinguished and revered practitioner of the genre in Puerto Rico. So this kind of self-criticality that you bring, that to criticize, be able to criticize one's own work, to see oneself with such objectivity and to even recognize one's role in a larger system, I think is quite brave and courageous, unusual and very humbling. And it also gets me to think about the maker, is the maker of these photographs. If you can go back to the Arlena Hom, the Margarita, that is, when we know the photographer of some of these photographs, and we do know the photographer of many of these photographs, and Pablo documents that very carefully, with great historical accuracy. This one, to me, was very striking because, well, not only is this just such an incredible image, but we know about the photographer, Pablo mentioned her, Margarita Arlena Hom, who, was quite an interesting woman in her day. She was she fought for women's suffrage. She was kind of a proto-feminist. She photographed the Spanish-American War. She photographed the Sino-Japanese War.
She was a real imperialist and super in favor of colony.
Exactly. But what I'm saying is it's complicated. She was somebody who we would see as a feminist in some ways, and working in a male universe of, most of the photographers would have been male at this time, so it's kind of extraordinary that a female at the turn of the 20th century would have been making these pictures. She had a particular interest in women's work, particularly women's food ways and food cultures. And so I often like to ask my students, does it matter who took these photographs? Does it matter? Does their biography matter? Do their intentions matter? Does the fact that there seems to be some sympathy between sympathy is not the word I'm looking for. There seems to be a powerful confrontation here. That's what I wanted to say. A confrontation here between the photographer and the subject, meaning that the subject appears to me, at least to my eyes, feels to be pushing back. There seems to be some self-possession, some dignity here. We don't know who this woman is, but the sheer power of her gaze gives her a kind of power, a kind of resisting power.
But I think it's important to point out that the captions are often not by the photographers.
Exactly. They were often
You see if you study this material, the same photograph used in different publications with different captions.
Right, and often by the editor or by the magazine or the publication that was publishing them. So it's just a question that I like to raise. Does it matter who the photographer is? Does it matter what their intentions were, and does that matter in our understanding and interpretation of the work? And I suppose this work reminds me of that issue, but it also reminds me of something that another one of my students said when we were walking through the exhibition together, actually a student from Puerto Rico, and he said to me, no matter how demeaning some of these photographs are, and so condescending, he said, in some of them, I just feel like you can't repress an individual, that the power of the individual just kind of pushes forth, despite how demeaning the image actually might be. And I think this is one of the images that I think pushes back in that regard. I'd love to hear if, comments on that. But to turn to another topic, unless did you want to say something else about?
I just want to, are we okay on time?
How are we doing on time?
Okay.
Yep, we'll wrap it up. Okay, then my last two questions, if I can. One has to do with site specificity, which we've already talked a little bit about. You can, if you want to talk about that with regard to Italy, but I think you kind of did a little bit, we could turn to the bigger question then, which is, can you talk about what it means for Puerto Rico and for Puerto Rican artists and Puerto Rican art to be put on this global stage?
1 million tickets were sold.
And the idea of no pavilion, you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, we can't have a pavilion because we're not a country. And Adriano Pedrosa, I think, understood that, and his choice of not just including this piece of work, but placing it where he placed it, I think he was very conscious, and I've talked to him about this, and that this becomes a de facto international pavilion. I mean, because we're not allowed to have a pavilion, right? And so.
Well, and the central placement of
I mean,
it.
there have been other approaches. I mean, Annabelle is here, right? I mean, Annabelle curated the collateral, but it's collateral, right? It's not it's collateral. It's an add-on because, right? So, and it was a wonderful effort, and you're wonderful artists. We showed the picture, I think, before you came in of the selfie, but yeah, I mean, people are not aware, and people are not interested because we are being erased, and there's the enormous, I don't know how to put it because it gets too very emotional, but the forces that wish to erase us and make us not exist are so prevalent, right? And so I think Adriano understood that, and he put it there for a reason. And I hope that I expressed that to him. I said, thank you for making this, for giving us the opportunity to make ourselves visible in this way. And Europeans were flabbergasted. I mean, the visitors to the pavilion, some of you have been there, some of you will go, and they're like, I never knew. They're much more interested in Cuba, people generally. Because we're sort of like fell into the cracks between neither here nor there, and so.
Back to the desk, the end image.
What's that?
Can you go back to the desk with Lolita, the end image?
Yeah.
The response
But
to
we should give time for questions.
Yeah, I'll just this could be a segue into that. The response to the exhibition was quite extraordinary. Not just foreigners everywhere, but Pablo's work in particular was singled out by many critics. Max Duron of the Art News wrote about the work in a very compelling way, and he kept talking about how the work really stands apart from the rest. And I wondered if you wanted to talk just a little bit about that before we turn to questions about how it was singled out and why you think it was singled out.
People got it. Some people got it, and then other very prominent critics didn't get it. And it was invisible to them, even though they had to have seen it. So
because you had to walk through it, you couldn't get through the foreigners everywhere. It was so central in that sense. But it seemed to be like an installation, like an art exhibit within an art exhibit, right? Because it had more of integrity as a show unto itself.
But what he did say in his review is that you had to pay attention and you had to take your time. And other reviewers who wrote about the Biennale even though they are professional art reviewers, they still didn't get it, and they thought it was a curated show. They didn't realize it was by one artist, even though it's perfectly clear there if you bother to read the signage. Yeah. But yeah, it's funny, right? That's good. It shows it kind of works.
Should I read what Nelson said about?
You can read what Nelson said,
Okay.
but then I
Yes,
think
and then
we
we'll
should open up to
okay.
questions.
Yeah, Nelson Rivera in his review, he wrote, given the superabundance of anti-capitalist art in the Central Pavilion, it may seem particularly offsetting that Pedrosa has inserted Delano's installation smack in the middle of it all. The Museum of the Old Colony occupies the central space of the building. It is the only piece in this privileged location, accessed by stairs at four ends, and it is thus physically and thematically isolated from the rest of the pavilion. Painted a military blue, including the entrances and entire ceiling, the Museum of the Old Colony is, in the context of the entire exhibition, the anchor piece of Pedrosa's curatorial statement. Delano's installation reveals how imperialism disrupts, contaminates, dismantles the cultural, social, and economic values of a community that is at a disadvantage compared to its invaders and exploiters. Under Pedrosa's curatorship, Puerto Rico serves as the summa of the disasters of capitalism, what would easily ravage the societies represented in the other works exhibited in the pavilion. This aspect is particularly unsettling, as welcome as it is. So maybe that's the place to end. I was going to ask Pablo to talk a little bit about what it means for this to come full circle in New York, right? Because the first U.S. installation was at the King Carlos Center, in 2017, I think, a full installation of it. So it is kind of coming full circle, and you did live in New York, but maybe we can open up to questions and you can get back to that. Okay.
We have time for questions?
So do we have time?
We're just gonna pass the microphone around.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations on this. It's a really beautiful exhibition, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking a little about the video components that play both in the entrance and then tucked away in the back, because I feel like it adds this really beautiful and haunting audio element while you're looking at these images.
Were you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounded
That's why
I spent an hour in there, and I woke up, walked out ready to light everything on fire. It was beautiful. It was so good.
I figured you were there because yes, it is. There's one in the front and one in the back, and the video that you encounter first is comprised mostly of footage from the 40s and 50s, and deals with, for one thing, the military bombing in Vieques, but also a lot of the footage is drawn from propaganda films that were made by outsiders, hired by the government to sell the island as a place for investment or one thing or another. But also a lot of newsreels having to do, for example, with Lolita Lebron's shooting up of the Congress with her comrades, and other historical issues at the time, all mashed up with tourism and all that. The second video is much more anchored in today, although and I updated it for the Biennial to include some of Biden making some lame remarks about how, what did he say, something like, "Oh, I grew up in the Puerto Rican community," but it's Trump and it's Biden and it's combined with footage from young people who are responding to the current situation in very beautiful and articulate ways. Some of you may know who Giovanni Roberto is, the director of Comedores Sociales. He's beautifully articulate and making a very compelling statement in that video. And what am I missing? Oh, there's also a very powerful scene. I didn't film it, so I can say it's powerful. I used it, but it's some of you may have seen it. It was posted on Facebook a lot and shared a lot of Dominicans arriving in Ayola on the west coast of Puerto Rico, They're arriving in this boat that you could not believe that the boat can even float. But it arrives being chased by the Coast Guard, and as soon as it hits the beach, like 20 men jump out, and they start scattering in all different directions. And the Coast Guard and the cops are chasing them everywhere, and a lot of the Puerto Ricans are trying to help them, like, yeah, siéntate aquí, corre para allá, and it's just this chaotic scene. But I included that partly because it's an important part of what's going on, but also to evoke the migrant situation in Italy, where the same thing is happening. People are dying by the boatloads. And in 2 biennales ago, an artist brought a boat from the bottom of the Mediterranean and put it on display as a work of art, a boat in which like some 80 people had died. So.
And the next Biennale will be, the director will be selected by a far-right government in Italy, right?
The president of the Biennale and the new prime minister of Italy, Meloni, is basically fascist sympathizer, and she appointed a new president of the Biennale, and the new president of the Biennale will appoint the next curator of the Biennale, and so, yeah.
So it's political. Small piece.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Hello, Professor. I'm actually studying
Good to see you.
Professor Delano.
And we had lunch yesterday in Hartford.
But thank you so much, Professor, and actually both of you, for this talk. It was really emotional to look at some of these images, because in a way, I feel like colonial photography has its own language. It is so similar to different cases of colonial photographies that I have encountered everywhere in the world.
Yes.
Right? There's certain kind of a gaze of the colonial system of the subject. But what I encounter also in the context of my own research in Vietnam is that by virtue of the camera being a technology that was introduced into the colony by the colonizer, these photographs are some of the rarest artifacts of a given moment in time that the colonized themselves didn't have access to. So what I see right now, in at least my own community, is that there's a lot of nostalgia for this kind of photography. And there's a lot of people who argue that this kind of photography allow them to look at their own history, right? In almost like a beneficial way, right? They were able to look at their own ancestor, right? In through the power of photography. So I wonder if that kind of nostalgia is also at play in this context of your work with Puerto Rico.
The answer is yes, of course, but I really would like Professor Guzman to reply to that, because it's something we've talked about a lot and something that you have experienced, right? Like you were telling me when you went to see the NYU, the responses that some of the people that some of the people that you saw respond fit that exactly, but very much so. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I can attempt to respond. So one of my first interactions with this exhibition was at NYU when it was just photographs, and I actually went with my mother, and she was very emotional, and she really questioned the use of the photographs. At that point, there was little text, and so I think I started going to museums, and she, like I think a lot of people, have a sort of a nostalgia and a love of museums, and I think the thing we were grappling with in that particular space was that Pablo, as an artist, as a curator, was giving us very little to work with. He wasn't sort of guiding us, and I think that's the power of this exhibition and how it's grown, is that he forces us to confront these images. He forces us to confront these histories of representation, and he doesn't give us easy answers or easy ways to sort of mediate this experience. What was very interesting in that moment, in that exhibition space, was there were other folks who were having a great time. We were having a deeply emotional, sad time, but there were other folks who were having memories of childhood, and they were having memories of an island that's changed a lot. And so I think part of sort of not guiding the visitor to have one particular sort of perception of this work sort of allows for the plurality of perception. But it was an interesting sort of moment for me as a visitor, but also as an anthropologist in all the different ways that people might interpret this work.
But it is one of the biggest challenges of how to navigate that, right? Because how much of that it's gonna happen no matter what, but is it something I wanna control?
Yeah, I wanted, if I can just add to what Amanda was saying and to your question and the idea of nostalgia. I remember walking through with a group of Puerto Rican colleagues into the exhibition at JMU, and we got to the Libby's corned beef installation with the flags, the U.S. and the Puerto Rican flag, and I started talking about how it's so horrible. It's so much food is imported into Puerto Rico. At 85% of food in Puerto Rico is imported, right? And this really unhealthy, horrible industrial food, And she started tearing up. One of my friends started tearing up. She said, "Oh, my mother had such amazing recipes for that Libby's, corned beef."
Yeah,
and she started rattling off all of these recipes, and it was this great sense of nostalgia. And then I thought, wow, people are going to have different reactions. People are going to have really different reactions, especially if they have personal relationships and they have taken a sense of ownership over that material. You can't tell somebody how to look at something. You can't tell somebody how to look at something. I think we had.
Okay, we need to.
Yeah.
One more?
One more, yeah, please.
One
I was
more.
just going to comment that the reception also depends, because the colonized are not a homogeneous group, right? The colonized themselves have been complicit with the colonizers, some of them, and so you're going to have lots of different kinds of reception because, so who has nostalgia? Not everybody can have nostalgia. So you're going to have these different registers based on kind of people and their relationship to the colonial past, present,
And that's really a part of this all part of the complexity of the images that I'm using. In fact, there's one that I didn't use in Venice because I didn't think it would, I have, 10 times more images that I could use, or so many more, but there's one I use in the Mac Museum, and I don't think I've used it anywhere else. Maybe it was a JMU, and it's an image that my title for the image is Los Vendepatrias. And it's all these men who were collaborators, and they're all standing there with American flags and their pith helmets on, right? And so I think that's it, right? We're done. Angel, yeah. Thank you all.
It's complicated.
No, I'm looking for many thanks. Okay?